This atheist student is about to reveal why he doubts the reliability of the Bible. Let's see what he says.
Discovered other gospels like the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, others that have been written at around the same time as the earliest gospels discovered, which still have been written about, 50 to 150 years after Christ. So how could you be sure that these are actual eyewitness testimonies, even if they weren't even written in the language of Jesus?
Okay, good question. The evidence is that the Gospels were written 20 to 60 years after the fact. The earliest fragment of a Gospel is the John Rylands fragment in the John Rylands Museum in Manchester, England. It's a fragment of the Gospel of John. It's dated between 117 and 138 AD. So that is 30 to 60 years after the writing of John, which is an incredibly short span of time. The early church fathers, Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, and Clement, Bishop of Rome, quote Matthew, Mark, and Luke in letters that they wrote in 95 and in 110 AD. So that is why I am convinced, the evidence is, the Gospels were written not 150 years after the fact. They were written in the first century, and obviously the eyewitnesses were around.
Real quick, I went ahead and fact-checked Cliffe on some of the things he just said, and he's absolutely right about the early church fathers quoting the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke around 100 AD. But what he was saying about the Rylands fragment of John, there's actually new information about that. It's been dated between 125 to 175 AD now, which is 25 later than Cliffe said in this video. The video is kind of old, so we'll cut him some slack. But it's still perfectly plausible that the Gospels were written by the original eyewitnesses, as you can see in this timeline that I'm showing on screen. It still lines up. But I will also note that there's debate over the authenticity of some of the early church father Ignatius's letters. He's the one who quotes a lot of the Gospels throughout this time. But 7 of the 15 are still largely considered to be authentic, since the 4th century historian Eusebius quotes a lot of them. Pretty strong evidence there. But let's see what else this student has to say. I'll save the rest of my thoughts for the back end.
And how can you be even certain that even if they were written earlier,
Right.
and back then they didn't have the translations we have, right, or even the way of transmitting information. We didn't have like the printing press. They had to transmit everything by hand. People had to copy them.
Yes.
At that time, people weren't that literate as we are today.
Correct.
So the translation, even with Aramaic, which is the language Jesus would have spoken, all the letters, all the Gospels written are in either Greek or Coptic, which are either the Egyptian language or the Greek language, which were the more popular ones at the time. So how can you be sure? Why isn't there anything written in Aramaic about Jesus? Why isn't there any historical account except for these Greek things that spread out that way more so than the other, for example?
You bet. Because Greek was the common trade language of that day. Undoubtedly, many Jews spoke Greek because it was the trade language of the day.
Right.
And so you're right. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were probably written in Greek, although there's a small possibility that Matthew was written in Aramaic. That's a possibility that an early church father alludes to. But we're not sure. But we have over 5,200 Greek manuscripts or pieces of manuscript.
Not all of them are identical, though.
Correct. There are many variants.
So how can you be sure that the gospel, or at least the translation, which is the translation of a translation, at least the compilation of the Bible that we have today was written or was actually compiled in the year 360 AD. So that's even more so after the fact than what we know today. All the letters, perhaps there were even more letters. Perhaps letters were fabricated, perhaps. So how do you know? Why do you take it for on faith that these specific letters, these 40-something letters, or books in general with the whole Bible, take it to be the absolute truth, even though it wasn't really, what we have today wasn't really existent until 360 years afterwards?
Okay.
Good question.
First point. We don't go from translation to translation to translation to translation. We go from the original Greek to English, the original Greek to Latin, the original Greek to French or Spanish. We have over 5,200 Greek manuscripts, and the New Testament was written in Greek. So we're not going through several different translations. We're going from Greek to English. Second point. The Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Pilate, the Gospel of Peter, the gospel of truth, the gospel of Judas. Those gospels were rejected at a fairly early date in the 2nd century because they were based on the philosophy of Gnosticism, which taught the physical is evil, the spiritual is good. Well, that comes right from Plato, the Greek Gnostics. Knowledge is key, the spirit is key, the physical is evil. And obviously, Jesus Christ contradicted that idea. And so does the Bible, because the Bible and Jesus insisted God created your body. It's a beautiful gift, take care of it. And he also created your soul, your spirit, your personality, take care of it. Now, what were the tests that were used to determine whether a New Testament document would be canonized, be part of the 27 New Testament books? 3 tests. First test, was it written by an apostle or by someone who knew an apostle? Second test, was it orthodox, meaning by that in agreement with the Torah, the Old Testament, and the apostolic oral tradition? And third test, was it used by the churches around the known world, around the Mediterranean, from Rome down to Alexandria, Egypt? If it met those 3 criteria, it was accepted into the New Testament canon.
So basically, the more popular, if it was lucky enough to be popular, then it would have been accepted. In other words, what if there was something? Why didn't Jesus actually write anything even?
I don't know why Jesus didn't write anything.
It's all
I don't know.
It's all faith then. Can
No.
I just?
You gotta be kidding me.
Yeah.
Just because someone doesn't write something doesn't mean it's all faith that I believe he existed.
You're taking it on the Bible that it actually existed, even though
Well,
the
yeah.
Bible claims to be eyewitness accounts, even though they were written several, even if it's decades, it's not an eyewitness account.
When you study U.S. history, do you necessarily study the letters of Abraham Lincoln or George Washington? Or do you read eyewitness testimony of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington?
Well, if I read the Epic of Gilgamesh, I don't really believe the guy actually fought with the dragon.
Because the literary style of the Epic of Gilgamesh is not historical narrative. That's why I don't accept it either as historical narrative.
So the Bible, as in historical narrative, would be Noah's flood, that
No.
Jonah was swallowed by a whale.
No.
Would that'd be historical narrative as well.
No, you don't read about Jesus next to Noah or Jonah. Instead, you read about Jesus in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, written in Greek in the 1st century by eyewitnesses. And when you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you'll notice it's not once upon a time in the land of Nod. Winkin, Blinkin, and Odd took Jesus on a boat ride. No, it does not read that way.
It does say that 3 kings came and bore him gifts.
Very good. No, they're not 3 kings.
3 wise men.
Thank you. 3 wise men came and offered gifts to Jesus. That's correct. Absolutely correct. That's historical, I would argue.
That they followed a star and the star led them. It doesn't seem all too historical as an account. And if you're basing it on the wording, then what's stopping people to make it word it in a way that sounds historical instead of a tale, for example?
Well, when you read the Gospels, it does not have the literary style of epic poetry, like the Iliad and the Odyssey of Homer. Instead, Luke chapter 3, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene. During the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John. Well, who gives a rip about who's tetrarch and governor? Well, Luke did. Why? Because the evidence is Luke was a meticulous historian. He's not just ripping this stuff up off the wall and making this stuff up. He's a meticulous historian, and he's writing it as historical narrative.
I got to give props to this kid, that Ethan. He's really well educated and also really respectful and is asking the right questions here. Like, these are tough to answer, and Cliffe did a great job with his responses too. I really respect that he cared to know the truth. But I feel like one thing that Cliffe kind of glazed over with Ethan's questions is about why popularity was a factor in determining the canon of the Bible. And when I think about this in like my own mind, using widespread acceptance as a factor would really help to counteract any potential biases that the early church council could have had when determining this canon. But ultimately, the canon was put together by God through the work of the Holy Spirit, and he used our flawed human processes in our ignorance to help reveal to us which books are inspired. And Cliffe also kept claiming that the Bible depicts an accurate historical depiction. And there's a few things I'd like to mention about that to support his claim. So for one, from my understanding, my own research, no facts presented in the Old or the New Testament have ever been proven to be false. They could be false, but they haven't been proven to be false. And also, over the years, there have been new archaeological findings popping up that support facts throughout the Bible. One big one that's kind of recent is the discovery of Sodom and Gomorrah and the evidence of a fiery, intense destruction of the city, which is also in alignment with what's depicted in the Bible. And finally, there's this consistency that's found in the New Testament as well, as there's over 30 historical characters in the Bible that have been historically confirmed by sources outside the Bible, like historians around that time. And this is so important for us to think about, because if the Bible is true, then that has like huge implications today. And it would mean that there's a God who loves you, who loves me, and who makes these 6 promises to all who believe in him. He will take care of your physical needs. He will give you rest. He will give you direction. He will help you when you're hurting. He will give you peace, and he will save you from hell. And I've been a Christian for 10 months, and so far, God has always kept these promises to me. And honestly, I feel like I don't deserve it, but he's really changed my life for the better. And I want you to experience these things too, if you haven't already. And so I hope you got something out of this video. Have a good day.